give me something to believe in along the way.
So this past week, we reached 8 billion people on the planet. I think they officially announced it. I don't know when they actually count that baby that popped out.
Yeah, how do they know which one actually gets to be claimed number 8 billion? They did narrow it down to an actual person, though. I don't know who got. Yeah, they claimed it was a certain county or a certain state it was born in. I can't remember. Can't remember where it was. Yeah, I don't know how they can do that, but apparently one of them got dibs on it.
Wow.
Yeah, but
seems like it'd be highly contested.
15th of November, 8 billion people. So hooray for that! More people, the better, right, Elon?
That's right.
According to Mr. Musk.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, it's momentous, and we're on our way, as we've discussed before, in you guys' lifetime, to maybe 9.5 billion and onward to 10 billion by the end of maybe 2100. So more mouths to feed, and hence the big challenge and big opportunity for agriculture.
And the non-linear increase to people too puts pressure on it. Like that rate has been rising faster and faster, so the need for innovation to keep up with that and surpass it is actually a greater task than just drawing that out linearly.
Right before we hit record, you were talking about do you want to just quickly rattle off that non-linear growth that you're talking about, just for the listeners?
So I won't hit all of them, but 2 billion was 1928, and then the next billion people came along, it looks like in 1959, so let's say 30 years, and then we take a look at this last jump from 7 to 8 billion, it only took 12 years, so 2010 to 2022, and so it's, it starts out looking linear, but then it exponentially increases as the way that multiplication kind of does when there's more and more people, and the exponential curve means that time is of the essence for keeping the supply of food for everyone ahead of the demand for people that need it. And so it's an even more daunting, for sure, and sometimes in history, and maybe maybe that'll happen again too, where it's a daunting task to actually get the right amount of food or an abundance of food for people. But I think that part is interesting, that it isn't. It actually gives you less time with how fast that can ramp up with how many people are coming.
Do you know when we hit the first billion people?
Yeah, I think it was like 1880. It took us
crazy?
about 10,000, 12,000 years to get there, to our first billionth person on the planet. And then,
when you were born, how many?
Yeah, I think there's like in 1964, I think there's like 3.5 billion people then.
Wow. So in your lifetime.
Seen it over double.
Yeah. It's really is spectacular. People it's good to bring up, because it's really an incredible accomplishment that not only do we have this exponential growth, as you said, Tommy. So we got to, it took 10,000 years to get 1 billion. Then it took like another 100 years to get 2 billion. Mm-hmm. And then once we hit the 60s, then we started adding 1 billion people every 12 or 13 years.
Crazy.
Yeah.
And now we just hit 8 billion, and I guess we'll, in the next 15 years we'll add another billion. So these it's been very condensed on the time period to add another billion people to the planet, and naturally that would cause a lot of alarm, and it did. It goes back to what Thomas Malthus, the Malthusian Catastrophe, was exactly the thing you talked about, Tommy, with exponential growth of people and population, but our inability to grow food in particular at the same rate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the contention was by Thomas Malthus. He was a reverend, a British guy, and he's super famous for his, thankfully, unrealized fear. He thought the world was gonna starve, and acolytes of Malthus, more recently Paul Ehrlich, who's in the 60s, wrote The Population Bomb, and he's been like the poster boy for the neo-Malthusian poster boy. And they've all been wrong, thankfully, in their prediction that there would be millions and billions of people starve and die, and in fact, it was kind of, they had this sort of terrible anti-human philosophy of maybe we need to cut off our your left arm to save the rest of the body. Like they were ready to throw away whole continents of the world, like the Indian subcontinent, and yeah, right. I mean, it's just terrible philosophy they had. They had no confidence in human ingenuity. Is what it really came down to.
What was it? If this is a recurring theme of this kind of doomsday predictions, has it been similar things come along each time to get us out of it? Clearly, as you said, it didn't happen. I guess for Malthus,
right?
His prediction. What was there? Was there a big singular event that changed the course of history?
Well, yeah, like there are some really key events that happened. Like I think it was William Crookes. He stood in front of the British Parliament in like 1888. Like, don't hold me to that number, but it was a while ago. And he made a speech to the British Parliament that the world is in terrible peril of starvation because of our lack of nitrogen and our burgeoning population growth, like the population explosion. So they could foresee it. They had no bloody nitrogen, and without nitrogen, you can't grow food. Mm-hmm. And I think we've all read that really great book called The Alchemy of Air, which is just a fantastical. It's like the Houdini escape in terms of escaping this terrible catastrophe through technology of being able to convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia that plants can use.
Is that the Haber-Bosch?
Haber-Bosch, those two German scientists, Fritz Haber and...
Back in 1888 or whatever year you threw it?
It was when they finally developed it. Yeah.
Okay.
Was it 1908, something?
I thought it was more recent. That's okay.
Maybe later than 1908.
But all the nitrogen in the world had been coming from natural sources. So here we go back to organic. And our message is don't rely on organic to feed the world.
The joys of collecting that natural organic nitrogen were something to behold. The coolies that they talk about in that book.
Coolies are the Chinese.
Yeah.
What is this?
They'd collect the guana, the bird excrement, seabird excrement from, was it Peru? Is that where they're
off
collecting
the coast
it from?
of Peru?
Off the coast of Peru, and that was
were there wars fought over
bird
that?
shit?
Is that true? It's ringing a bell that there was specifically for that to get the nitrogen-rich rocks.
Yeah.
Whoever could claim the source of nitrogen had an upper hand because nitrogen. Well, it still is, it's somewhat finite, but it was completely finite then. So there was, I think battles, and it was who could get the upper hand had the access to that, and the saltpeter, that the chili saltpeter, the potassium nitrate in the soil. There's certain areas in the world that have the right, combination of potassium or sodium nitrate. I think it was called saltpeter.
Saltpeter, yeah.
So guana and saltpeter, Chile and Peru were housing a lot of they're keeping that population going. And so back to your comment earlier about how the Malthusian way of thinking was, okay, they know that there's this amount of nitrogen, there's not more or less coming. Food production, you can only make incremental increases, across time. Population explosion is exponential.
Non-linear.
So those two lines are going to intersect, and that's where the issue is going to come from. But innovation changes the slope. And that is where the Haber-Bosch system can kind of come in, and probably it's a couple billion lives credited of saving, with that invention of taking the atmospheric nitrogen, making ammonia, something that previously microbes were reliable for doing in the
pulling
soil.
Pulling nitrogen out of the air into
to fertilizer. Putting it into liquid nitrogen form for fertilizer and using huge amount of energy.
Yeah. How do you know the process?
Just high pressure. They're able to force the molecules together, heat and pressure, and factories. And I mean, they scaled it. Obviously, it started out really small to prove the concept, but now I think you maybe mentioned this even last episode or a couple of ago, but like the total energy input it takes up, this process still today takes up 1 to 2% of all of the world energy. That's how important nitrogen is.
Wow.
And therefore that's how important this process is that can take the readily available nitrogen, readily in quotes. It's not usable in the form that it is, but it's there in the atmosphere. Yeah, 70 to 80% of atmosphere is that nitrogen, like you were mentioning, and being able to collect that and use it for productive purposes. Yeah, it's
jumping. Oh, go ahead.
Nope, just gonna round by saying it's a big time energy sink, but one that no one would question is it seems to be worth it.
Yeah, well, I don't remember where I was reading it, and I won't know the details, so don't come to me for the details. But going way back in history to the expansion of the Roman Empire, reading that's an interesting piece of it as to why they constantly were expanding was to get to more fields with essentially more nitrogen, so that they could continue to feed their empire. And so, since they weren't able to return nitrogen to the soil, their only option was to continually move outwards and set up trade lines back to the empire. I guess maybe I'd never thought about why the constant expansion, but that was a fascinating little tidbit that I wasn't aware of. But then
to feed their people, they weren't able to just keep the same amount of land they had and just become more efficient. They just went and got more untapped land and grew their food, further and further out, and were able to feed their growing empire.
It's like an absolute necessity, nitrogen to
it's the humans. It's quite critical.
Yeah, I guess
maybe it's rate limiting. Constraint for growing crops, that and CO2. But, and maybe it's they still practice called slash and burn, but, slash down the forest and burn it. And that must fix some nitrogen when you do that for a short period. I'm not sure do you know what that process is?
No, the slash and burn, it sounds like the witch hunt era.
Yeah, right.
Is that a different slash and burn?
It's a different one.
Build a bridge out of it.
For having a short-term gain in fertility of land by burning.
Is that why?
Yeah. Then you got to keep moving. You're exhausted, and like 2 crops, it's exhausted. You got to move on, burn down some more.
Yeah.
Still
practice used today is the controlled burns. Is that kind of what you're talking about, or is this different?
I think maybe that's part of it. The control burns maybe is also to control certain types of weeds, or maybe a combination. But it's certainly you get a spike in fertility right after a burn.
Yeah.
And but I know you mentioned nitrogen being the cruel irony. It's called the dead gas because 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So we're literally drowning in nitrogen. But it's not available to plants to use. They need, it's called the dead gas. It needs to be fixed. Fixed is a funny word to say, but you got to fix it. And the way it's fixed is in nature by lightning. Lightning strikes with so much heat and energy and lightning, because you mentioned the energy needed by these Haber Bosch factories. 2% of the world's electricity energy goes towards fixing nitrogen. The other way is by bacteria can do it in a symbiotic relationship with leguminous or legume plants and their root nodules. So it's a fascinating process where the bacteria do the job for the plant, and then we get to eat the plant, and our animals eat the plants, and we benefit.
Part of the rationale for crop rotations.
Absolutely, it's the
work
rationale.
In the legume in between 2 years of corn, 1 year of beans.
And then help replenish some of the nitrogen in the soil. And then the third way is to use the Haber Bosch process and convert nitrogen into ammonia. So ammonia is a form of a nitrogen compound, and oddly enough, I think plants can they can only uptake inorganic nitrogen. So even organic has to be converted to inorganic to use it. So synthetic nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch process has been applied to fertilized lands ever since the 1930s, and that's helped. Excuse me, that's really been the biggest thing that's helped feed the world. To your point earlier, Jack, about what are the things that have made it possible. That's number one. Then along came this guy called Norman Borlaug from Minnesota. He was born in Iowa, but he received the Nobel Peace Prize, and so did Haber and Bosch. The other reason they needed the ammonia or the nitrogen plants, Jack, was to also for ammunition. For all the gunpowder in World War I, World War II, they were desperate for ammo.
Because there's an interesting history with Fritz Haber, right? That he's credited with, correct me if I'm wrong, but helping develop the chemical warfare.
He's kind of the
weapons like the chlorine gas
of that,
trench warfare. So
he's a polarizing figure in history.
Talk about the good and the ugly.
Yeah,
right.
That's just an interesting. I'm reading about it here because as we were talking about it,
I think his wife was so shaken to her core by the sort of the Machiavellian nature of Fritz Haber that she committed suicide. She couldn't live with the horror that he was involved with Zyklon B, for gassing in the concentration camps, and he also was the leader of the mustard gas and chlorine gas in World War I.
That's what
So yet he's credited with saving 4 billion lives. So it's a real Jungian, Taoist yin. I mean, he's got both sides, the good and the evil.
The extremes of both.
Yeah. So his wife, she committed suicide. She could not handle the horror that he had become. But anyway, so that
interesting.
Yeah, really. So they had a need for food, for growing food, fertilizing lands, which we're still benefiting from today, and then for ammunition and dynamite and all the explosives for the war, to fight the wars. So nitrogen's had a light and dark side to it. And then the second thing was Norman Borlaug with the Green Revolution, and he took this ability of the ammonia or fixed nitrogen, and then applied it to plant breeding. And he's the father of the Green Revolution during the 60s through the 70s. Credited with saving another billion lives through his plant breeding techniques, using dwarf strains of wheat and rice and combining it with now copious amounts of nitrogen.
Does he have a polarizing side to him? How many people is he responsible for killing?
No, I think Norm was just a straight up good guy. Nice Lutheran boy from northern Iowa.
Minimal mustard gas.
Yep. He was like, hold the gas.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he, by all accounts, he was a magnificent human.
Yeah.
And hardly anyone knows about him, but he received like presidential award. He received they've even built a statue of him, I think, in certainly in Washington, D.C., outside the Capitol now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but no one knows about him.
Yeah, he's not taught about. I know that. He's not a part of history that is part of the curriculum for some reason.
Right. Everyone knows about, Mother Teresa and Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi, but Norman, Dr. Borlaug saved, 1 billion lives, and not to denigrate their efforts, but by comparison, he's in the major leagues, and yet he's unknown. But no, Mother Teresa, if you're listening in, I'm actually very fond of you. So yeah,
those would be the two big ones, though, right?
Yeah, and then along comes just huge incremental gains on it's a flywheel effect, I think, where you add 1,000 different technologies to those two big ones.
Yep.
Yeah. And the fossil fuels has driven everything. So we can't forget the gift to humanity of all those dinosaurs and plankton dying over billions of years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, for your sacrifice. Because, without fossil fuels, none of it would have happened.
Yeah.
But it's really, really staggering. We escaped the Malthusian trap and looks like we're good to go, and if we're allowed to keep adapting with ingenuity and technology, we can feed 10 billion people, no worries.
Yeah, maybe it's a good time to use Norman's quote. What is that exactly?
Yeah.
That one, I think you maybe referenced it last time, but...
Yeah, and Dr. Borlaug, before he died, he said, to paraphrase, we'll have no trouble feeding 10 billion people. The question is will we be allowed to?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because he's very worried about this anti-science zealotry that's creeping in, and would hijack the human ingenuity of farmers and scientists and industry to produce food. He saw that as the greatest threat, that's on the horizon. Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah, he's definitely right. I mean, we see it all the time. We talked in the last podcast about, this sort of a return to ancient times, a resistance of using modern techniques and technologies, and it's it's an indulgent recklessness is fundamentally what it is, because we got a lot of people to feed, as we mentioned, 8 billion people, and then I lost my slides here, but 8 out of 10 will be in Africa and Asia of all the people that'll be born by the year 2100. So that's in 70 years. But by the year 2050, that's only 30 years away, 28 years away. 50% of all the newborn people are going to be in countries that most people haven't even heard of, like Nigeria and in Pakistan and in Afghanistan and in there's African countries primarily and Asian countries, but it's not the people aren't going to be here in America.
Yeah.
And they're sure as hell not going to be in New Zealand or Australia. They're going to be in these countries in
the places that already have trouble producing the food they need and
right.
the resources they need. And there's already, well, as you've hit on in the past, some restrictions already are making it hard on them already with Europe's influence on how they're able to grow their crops and how they're able to farm, and they're being withheld from the most efficient aspects of agriculture that we get to enjoy over here. And that just happens to be where all the people are going to end up being.
Right. I mean, so if we have any sense of compassion, like true compassion for people, then we need to be sort of thinking in a hierarchy of values that would be like, okay, what will do the poor of the world the most good, and rising incomes is number one, and ability to produce food. Maybe they go hand in hand in some respects, but they have to be the highest values because without food you can't live. And, I mean, it's pretty fundamental. Yeah, you write that down. Yeah, and then also with rising incomes, then the quality of food becomes much more available and better, and also as people become more wealthy, they have the ability to, well, they have the reality of looking after the environment better. It's like you travel around the world to these third world, countries or poorest nations where there's a lot of people, and you can't help but be assaulted by the pollution, and you want to say, well, what the hell? This is so filthy, it's just terrible. Like the smell and the sights but it's like, but and you can get overwhelmed by that almost. But the fundamental problem is they're poor. And the miraculous, thing is if we can liberate their economies through trade and and through cheap energy. Here we go back to energy again. You got to have cheap energy. That is number one. Cheap energy drives cheap food, and it drives economies, economic growth and wealth, and then the environment follows. Look, I was just rereading a book about the Sinclair Lewis, or Upton Sinclair. He wrote The Jungle, about the shit show of the Chicago, with as the home of the slaughterhouses, the packing plants in America.
Yeah.
Back in the 1800s, where the Irish and all the immigrants came in and worked there. And the rivers were, I think they famously set the river in the lake of Michigan on fire. There was so much tallow and shit floating in there. And like the workers, they were up to their knees in blood and guts working in these slaughter plants. There's 1 million head of, I think 1.5 million head a month they were processing just in Chicago. And so you think about what a disaster that was 100 years ago. Like, you imagine if you were transported back in time. But now look today. I mean, Chicago is a beautiful city. It's like, mind you don't get shot, but other than that, it's a beautiful city. And, clean and modern, and that's been the story of mankind. London used to be rat-infested, mud, slime, and a magnificent city, and so economic growth has lifted it. That's what happens. You get people, I think the number Bjorn Lomborg, he'll know for sure, and we know him, but if you get people to a family income of like $2,500, $3,000, it's not much. But you get over that, and then all of a sudden, the environment starts getting taken care of as well.
He talks about even something as simple as heating homes and cooking, and the environmental / pollution / deaths that come from that, of this, poor countries having to rely on open flame cooking, burning things inside their home for warmth and for cooking their food, and the negative effects, if environment concerns are part of that be likely larger from that, but also just the detrimental effect it has on human health from having not great access to cheap energy and warmth. That's their mode to get it, and even just raising them out of poverty, that would be one of the first issues that could be handled or tackled by that too.
Yeah,
seems like that's I just heard him talking about that recently, Bjorn Lomborg I think he was on Joe Rogan, but it was, I hadn't heard that before. It was interesting that's still, millions maybe succumb to that every year. It's a very real issue that, has effects that aren't maybe talked about as much as other things today.
Yeah, well, you go in India, you'll see this, you drive through rural India, and even not so rural. I mean, India is, for all intents and purposes, is the largest populated country in the world now. It's like China maybe doesn't want to admit it, but I think India's beat them out now. But they're the home to the largest cattle herd, in the world. In India, the cattle are sacred, so they're not allowed to kill cattle in India. It makes you wonder what they do with like their 100 million head of cattle, buffalo. They have a lot of buffalo there.
What do they
domesticated buffalo?
Why do they have such a big herd?
Well, the big herd is because they're sacred, and so people they worship cows. I mean, they look after them, and they're roaming free. It's the damnedest thing. Right in the cities, there's cattle laying on the road. Everyone has to go around them.
Really?
Yeah. They're wandering everywhere in the marketplaces where they're selling food and people are buying, and then the cow will come and nuzzle in beside you and reach in there and grab like an apple or something off the shelf. It's like, and they don't beat them away with a stick or anything. They kind of gently push them away, and then they're in all the garbage piles too. So they're recycling.
Are they owned? Like, do people know which?
No, they're kind of community. They're kind of communal. I suppose some are owned. The dairy cows are owned for sure. Cows? No.
Okay.
Do they get any?
Because all the male calves can't be milked. I don't know if you knew that or not, but I mean, if you're really vigorous, I guess you can get some milk out of them. But
Well, is there any?
But by and large,
industry
you
around
can't. Yeah, dairy. There's a big dairy industry for
Okay.
milking buffalo. For like a special mozzarella cheese comes from buffalo, but and then there are some modern dairy cows too. There, they love milk. The Indians, and a lot of their dishes have got milk in them.
Yep.
So they're definitely not lactose intolerant. The Indian population, they love them. But anyway, I digress. Well, you're back to your point about fuel. Outside every home in the rural India is these teepee of dung pats. You know,
Yeah.
that their job, the women's job and children, is to gather up the dung from all the cattle. So if they own cattle, they catch their manure, and if they're wild roaming cattle, they bring them in, and they're very fibrous and they dry because it's hotter than hell in India. And then they use them for cooking. That's their main fuel source for cooking today. And today, yeah, for all their cooking is done with recycling cattle manure, which still has a high, dry matter fiber content, burns very well.
Wow.
So if you just said that and had people guess what era that is, you would think so long ago when that was maybe happening.
Right. You'd think when
Not 2022.
No, right. But today that's still the case. So
It's interesting this this intersection of energy and egg and I mean, I've said it a couple times, but energy leads everything, including egg. I don't know that it's an obvious connection that everyone makes. Might be able to think they're somewhat independent. So then when we hear about scenarios like that in India, but and then we're also here in the Western world and developed world here about shifts away from dependable and high output energy types to solar and wind, and in a general regression on our grid overall. And you start to understand this impact that energy plays on ag, and the fact that there's parts of the world that are still so far behind where we are now when we're talking about taking fundamental steps backwards with our energy policies. It's you start to see maybe pretty quickly how when you hear these headlines of food insecurity and looming famines, it's a little more you can see maybe where it's stemming from. It's not just ag as an isolated industry, is it?
Right. They're linked. They're absolutely intractably linked together. Our ability to produce food and energy. Yeah. And as we talk, the cornerstone one could be just for nitrogen. It's the rate limiting nutrient. CO2 is great because it's a free gas. For plants use it, plants need it, and they expire oxygen, which we use. So, CO2 is a miraculous gas, but it's free. And but nitrogen isn't. And in order for plants to use that, we have to use human ingenuity and crush it in extreme heat through these processes, and that takes huge amount of energy. So we're seeing this, Jack, played out on this again through very acutely through the Ukraine-Russian war conflict that continues, and so the world is starting to really the developed world for the first time in our lifetimes. There was the big energy crisis way back with Nixon in like 1973 when we had the oil embargoes that all the Arab states placed on the U.S. and then on Europe, and basically shut down, our economies. And so we haven't seen it. Many people have never seen such a crisis looming in their lifetime. Certainly it was before you guys were born. And so now the modern world is starting to feel this pinch of what happens if you lose energy, and then you lose your ability to produce ammonia, fertilizer, and then you lose your ability to grow crops, and then all of a sudden you got lack of food, and then you've got extremely high rising prices of food. And So energy deficits equals high food cost. That's a short equation.
It's a pretty obvious link and chain of events to follow. Like, it's not that difficult to understand the logic behind what you just laid out there. So when you see, this overall call to reduce, nitrogen and the things, headlines and stories like that. I don't, obviously the Dutch one is a famous one of recent, but how is that even a entertainable thought if it's quite quickly we could see, just how important nitrogen is, and few steps later it's high prices because of lack of, it's just supply and demand. How is it something that's still being talked about, that cutting back on these technologies?
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing.
Or why is what's the harm, I guess maybe is the question. So the obvious benefit of nitrogen is everything we've talked about for the last 40 minutes. What is the flip side of it, the con that they're trying to caution us away from when they want to reduce nitrogen fertilizer?
Yeah, excess nitrogen and, as a pollutant would be, I think, the concern that would be mostly talked about if it's oversupplied, overprovided, or excreted from cattle or from animals. It could be on the crop side or the animal side. There's outputs of nitrogen that maybe doesn't get utilized, that then, being washed away and going into the waters, or maybe something like that is the concern of we're not as concerned about that at the moment, and people would maybe like to circle that as the next item.
Sure.
And so that's what we're starting to see, is nitrogen coming more into the focus of ways to reduce our environmental impact. And so
nitrogen's it's expensive, right? Fertilizer. So wouldn't there be a natural incentive to not overuse it if it's an input that costs you a lot of money? Like, that's a really simplistic breakdown of probably a complex issue, but in principle, if you're worried about overusing it, isn't it kind of a self-balancing thing? You wouldn't want to overuse something you have to pay a lot for.
So on the crop side, I think that's 100% accurate. I don't know enough to speak to why there would be scenarios where they'd over-provide it. I think it's trying to provide it to the right amount that they need it for. The animal side, there is some case to be made that they don't need all of the nitrogen that they do get. But
what does it do for animals? I didn't know you.
In protein. So nitrogen would make up crude protein, or protein in general. And so it's the component that makes something qualify as crude protein is nitrogen. And so that's why, if you guys, is crude protein a term you guys hear about or know about? Okay, maybe that's already getting into, it's good to have the reality check, because in my world we talk about crude protein all the time. For
metabolizable protein.
So this is totally new to me. So nitrogen in the plant world is fertilizer. What is nitrogen in the animal world? You're not feeding them fertilizer.
Is a pretty critical component of amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins, and then so lean tissue and.
But what's the actual product? How do you get nitrogen into cattle in your?
Oh, how do you?
Just like fertilizer to crops.
Yep. Okay. So the feed. So different feed stuffs would have different levels of nitrogen. Okay. Yeah, I don't understand your question, but there'd be.
You're too smart for my dumb questions. think
different
dumber.
levels of think protein.
Yep.
Like this protein in all the different foods.
Sure.
There's protein in the hay, the grass. There's protein. Even there's some protein in the corn, of course. And then soybeans are a famous protein source, and different things that the nutritionists will take that nominal protein level and work that into the animal's diet ration, so that the animal will be provided with enough that they can extract that. When they break down that protein, they can extract the nitrogen from it, and then they can use that to rebuild like muscle and meat and immune cell. Every aspect of their body, of our bodies, requires nitrogen.
Okay. Well, there's the quick background. That's helpful. So I still want my first question. You were saying before I took us on a tangent that there is an argument maybe that in the animal world in the livestock world, it's being overused.
So this depends how deep we want to go on the science behind it, but
I'll let you know when I'm bored.
bored.
Hey, done. No, I am interested.
So
Say uncle.
amino acids, they form together, peptide bonds make protein. So amino acids, building blocks for protein. Animals have amino acid requirement, not a protein requirement. And so amino acids and there's 20 amino acids, that might be, there's essential and non-essential. And so the essential ones are the ones that need to be provided in the diet, or you can't make them internally. And so those need to be provided to the animal. Let's stick to cattle when we're talking about this, just to be on the same page. But they have an amino acid requirement. 10 of the amino acids they can make inside, 10 of them need to be provided. But the levels that are required for each individual amino acid are not the same. And so,
Sure.
And it's called the limiting amino acid theory, or it's not really a theory. It's known. That's what it is. But limiting amino acids means, say, for instance, that lysine is an amino acid. Its requirement might be, at the bottom, let's say it needs 3 grams of lysine, and they need 10 grams of methionine. But if the feed that's provided doesn't have that right ratio,
Sure.
if you don't meet lysine's 3 grams, methionine, all of those grams are going to be wasted because that can't go towards a productive purpose until the most limiting amino acid is met. And so if you overprovide crude protein, or protein in general, then you try to mask the limiting amino acid effect. But because each animal's different and each scenario is different to determine what that perfect balance of amino acids is going to be.
Err on the side of more.
So you err on the side a little bit more. Plus, because a lot of the feedstuffs that we're using are somewhat cheap that can bring in the protein. And the beautiful part about nutrition is that the excess amino acids, say that you've met all of your amino acid requirements, but you overprovided it, the carbon skeleton portion of that amino acid can be burned as energy and go towards growth. It does mean that some nitrogen may leave the body, though, that wasn't gone, that didn't get tied up into protein or into an amino acid and put into tissue. So that would be. Are you bored yet?
No, I'm
that would be why.
I'm less bored than I am lost, but I just think that's interesting.
That's at least one reason why that protein can be overprovided to livestock species, because if you underprovide it, if you're limiting an amino acid, they're just not going to grow efficiently. And
so you don't want to risk underproviding it.
Correct.
Essentially.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
In a
that would be right.
Okay.
Ideally, you could take a sample of the animal and figure out its exact amino acid requirements, and then formulate the diet to do that and plug that in. That's just not. It's not realistic. There's big strides being made in that area. Monogastrics or pigs and poultry are further ahead on that regard.
Sure.
But and dairy is probably ahead of beef in that regard. But ruminants in general, it's tricky to provide the amino acids in the perfect balance that they need.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about huge. What's the cattle herd in the United States alone? Beef cattle.
There's beef is 14 million head on feed, 12 million head on feed. I think overall is at 90 million cattle. Cows and cattle.
Let's talk about doing the ideal example. Like it's just not feasible. So I see where you don't want to risk not getting the effect out of it. So it's.
And if you're handling the manure correctly, which there's a lot of regulations in place for, any farm of consequence or size, they have to follow very strict rules on the, retention ponds and then how they handle their manure and plus it's money to them too. They're going to take care of their manure because we talked about nitrogen then going back onto,
it's worth
if
a lot of
they
money.
Can sell it to neighbors that maybe have crops, or if they have crops of their own, they just put it back on.
Put it back on the land to grow the next crop.
Yep. So it goes back
so
on
it recycles.
Yeah.
Goes around and around.
Interesting.
You were talking about on the protein. It made me think about the bacteria because with cattle they get some of their amino acid protein requirement from the bacteria in their rumens. So they're sort of an intermediary role of the microorganisms in the rumen. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a big part of their overall protein requirement comes from the bugs themselves. And so a ruminant makes them unique, the rumen stomach. I think we've talked about that a little bit, but that's, they take a bite of feed, they swallow it, we're in the rumen. That's the first spot. And in the rumen, it's anaerobic, no air, very limited amount of air, so it's fermentation. Anaerobic fermentation requires microbes. So there's a very diverse set of microbes that are in there. Bacteria, protozoa, fungi, viruses, archaea, methanogens. Those would kind of be all of the different types of things that make up what a microbiome is. They are in there. They can break down the feeds. And so that, in essence, if you're a beef or dairy nutritionist, you're a nutritionist of microbes, rather, because they get first crack at the feed.
As opposed to feeding the animal.
Yep. They get the first dibs. They get to take what they want out of the feed. But it's symbiotic because these microbes are provided a safe place to grow and live, and they get the nutrients, and it's the right environment for them. If that's all it was, that's a one-way street. The ruminant gets something pretty unique out of it too, because they get these end products of microbial fermentation, which the microbes themselves don't necessarily utilize. It's a undesirable end product in some regards to them, called volatile fatty acids. That's the main VFA, volatile fatty acid.
Okay.
Yep. And so that's the main energy source for a ruminant. So 70% of energy for the animal comes from these microbes, and a wasted end product of their fermentation process. So the animal, the cattle, they're able to absorb that out, the VFAs out. But the microbes themselves, back to your question, Dad, about the protein contribution from these bugs themselves. If you picture just the digestive tract in general, starts at the mouth, and then the back end is the end process of it. All the way through it, the fluid and digestive flows. So it starts in the rumen. The feed will then end up making its way reticulum, then the omasum, then the abomasum. So the abomasum is like our stomach, what we have. That's the true stomach where the pH, it's really acidic. The feed flows, but obviously some of these microbes are going to flow with it. And so these microbes, when they make it into the abomasum, they pass through this low pH environment, and now they're ready to be broken down when they get into the duodenum, the small intestine. And there, that's a big part of the protein, because microbes have, they might be 30% of their structure is protein. And so, and that's absorbable in the hind gut or in the small intestine for cattle. So they're able to, it's called microbial crude protein. So that's what flows. The bugs themselves end up in the small intestine. They get broken down, and then that nitrogen, or the amino acids that are in those, in those microbes, the bacteria, it's quite, it's not the perfect blend of amino acids, but it's pretty dang good. It matches our needs, or the animal's needs, really well. And so they're able to absorb it. It's a high quality protein. And so they're able to absorb that and then utilize it for their growth. And so, the bugs flow in through the digestive tract.
The cattle's digestive tract's kind of like a refinery. It starts with something crude, and then by the time it gets to the small intestine, it passes through all these different, digestive organs that you mentioned. And then it's a very, very well refined product.
Yes.
For the animal to finally absorb. Right?
That's right. I mean, that's
crazy.
The beauty of the ruminant is.
So back to India, where the cattle are everywhere, and you'll see them on the streets, and all the cars are honking the horns and the rickshaws, but they're standing in all the garbage piles eating. Like, I swear they're eating everything. Plates, plastic, like car tires.
Like a pig.
They're car tires.
No, but they're eating all the food that's been thrown out of every restaurant and just in piles on the street. Like, it's really something to see. But that's, and then you wonder, these cattle, but here they are. They can eat damn near anything.
Insane.
By benefit of their of this digestive system. And so then you you think about all those cattle and on the streets there, and they look so healthy too, by the way, shiny and everything. But and then you think, well, they can eat almost anything and be healthy, and then you think about them turning that waste product into good beef protein. Of course, in India they can't eat them. So all those cattle get shipped in the middle of the night when they're ready over to Bangladesh and Pakistan, where they're Muslim nations and they love to eat beef. So that's where they, Jack, to answer your question, that's where they go. But you don't want to be seen doing that, or you
Sure.
or you get, you get in huge trouble. In fact, you might get killed. I mean, anyway, they take it pretty serious. Back to my recycling or upcycling point. 40% of food produced for humans is wasted. And in the West, we're guilty of this. 40%. You think about it. So half the food basically in some people's homes is just thrown away. It's either not eaten.
Is that where the level of the wasting mostly? Is it the consumer level, or is it?
It's at different level.
Sure.
In the wealthy world, it's mostly at the consumer
Really?
level. But in the impoverished world, it's mostly because they don't have good storage
Sure.
for the food. They don't have refrigeration.
Yeah.
They got rodent, pest problems. They got heat, fungus, problems. But in the wealthy world, it's a lot of it's just thrown away because we got bored with it. The chips aren't quite crunchy enough, so you throw them away. Or we're 2 days over the expiration date on a stick of butter.
It's never stopped you.
No,
2.5
right.
years.
Right. Anyway, so cattle can take a lot of human or byproduct waste products and convert them into beef. And I think we need to talk about that because a lot of people think, they should only be eating grass because grass is green and pure and it's like from the sound of music. It's got a few flowers growing in the pasture and everything. It's got butterflies and it looks so beautiful. And cows are not made to eat grain. That's what we hear all the time. Mm-hmm. But it turns out cows, they bloody love grain and other food sources that come from grains that humans, can't quite. That we don't utilize ourselves. So maybe we could chat about that. I think it's fascinating.
Well, I think go ahead.
They're kind of like the garbage disposal a little bit. They
Literally
allow a lot
India.
of
India example.
yeah, like they actually are in India, but they also play that role here to a much less known extent. A lot of the human oil industries, they're very valuable. They all create byproducts. Which ends up being, the oil might only be, like a sunflower, for example, and oil might only be 15% of that product, but that's the valuable part for a lot of, sunflower oil. It can be quite valuable.
Cooking oils.
And all these cooking oils for the human purposes, but oil isn't the main part of a lot of these oil seeds. And so you squeeze the oil out, and now you're left with 85% of the product you started with, no real use for it besides the ruminant. And so if the ruminant wasn't there,
or you could
all these other
landfill
industries have, big amount of waste on their hand or on their hands. And so 40% of food waste it's a big deal, but without the ruminant, it would be
way more,
considerably higher.
The
potato industry, they rely very largely on the ruminant businesses and industries around where the potatoes are produced because there's a lot of,
peels,
sorted off potatoes and peels and slurry and things like that come from that industry that just don't make food grade, and they get to go into cattle to make nitrogen and or ultimately protein for us to consume. But so we want to dive into that a little bit. Is that right? You want to talk through
I think
the
it's
upcycling part of it?
Well, before that, I think it's interesting observation. All of that would get lumped in as grain fed, right? And
Right.
You just mentioned, 6 different things that, to my knowledge, aren't grain. But so it's another occurrence of funny vernacular that doesn't lead the consumer to the truth of what's happening. You hear people that grain fed cattle are just force fed corn until they're sick, which is so wrong on so many different levels. But they don't. It seems that it's not well known that your brewery, your favorite microbrew, you like drinking the beer. Well, it turns out they have a shit ton of waste that comes from it that you don't think about because it's fed to cattle.
Yeah,
all the
Brewers'
barley, the hops. And then whiskey. Like
Correct.
your Buffalo Trace. Well, the wheat or the grains that they use to distill, that all goes to that byproduct goes to cattle. Cotton, like our beautiful clothing.
Yep.
Well, once they pluck the lint off the cotton, all of those cotton seeds go to cattle instead of being wasted. Almonds, very popular now. Well, once they extract the so-called milk out of the almonds, like Tommy said, you got 85%. Yes, so-called milk.
Soy hulls.
Soy hulls, citrus. Your
citrus
morning,
pulp.
your orange juice for with your bagel in the morning. For those of you who like bagels. And then all of that.
It's like a type of person. I think everyone likes bagels.
For sure it is. They all live in the East Coast.
So why does it get why is it called grain? Is it just because it's an easy catch-all?
Yeah.
Or is it because these are supplementary pieces to a grain diet?
It's a good question. I actually don't know exactly. It probably all gets lumped into I think a lot of people wouldn't know that rations are quite complex. So if they're not on pasture eating grass, the alternative is that they're grain fed. It's not exclusively grain. Grain's a pretty large component of an efficient beef animal diet if they are being fed in a confined area. But
what percent, like in a normal ration that you would put together, what percent would be grain? Something would be classified as grain.
Yeah, it'd be if it's a finished, so a steer, let's say, or a beef animal that's getting ready to go to market, it would be maybe, it could be 50 to 60% grain.
Basically, the largest single type
or
of
non-forage. Forage and non-forage is maybe a good way to think about it.
Yeah, so forage would be quite minimal. And we can talk through that as well if we'd like. But
I'm more so just trying to wrap my head around the word. But
grain.
Be the largest percentage
grains.
of like a single unit.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Corn.
Okay.
Corn is the main ingredient. And
so maybe it's not all
when people are saying that they're grain fed, they're pretty much right for that portion of their life. But even an animal that's finished on grain, there's studies that break it down. They still, over its lifetime, 85% of what it ate was forage. So a grain fed animal is 85%, forage intake from birth to slaughter. And so they're still predominantly forage fed. But the perk of the ruminant is their ability to, one, utilize things that we can't utilize or don't want, things that are completely inedible to us. And, we talked a little bit about this in the last podcast potentially. But
we can't digest cellulitic material.
Yeah, it's the number one.
We'll starve.
Yeah, we just can't digest fiber. Humans, mammals don't have the enzymes that are required to break down fiber, and it just so happens cellulose is the most abundant organic compound on Earth, and we can't use it. And the cattle, the ruminant cattle,
love it,
and it's the microbes. So these microbes that are
Thank
in the gut
God
that
for
we
the
talked
bugs.
About. Well, exactly. The fermentation, they're able to extract the nutrients that they need from it.
So let me ask you this: if you're feeding grains to cattle, as a PhD nutritionist, I mean, does that make cattle unhealthy? Period. By feeding them grain.
No,
because a lot of people, we hear it all the time. Jack and I, we hear it all the time that grain is unhealthy for cows. It poisons them. It's bad for them. It's terrible. Whatever. It's like, but you say no. That's not true.
It's I mean, that's the thing that you guys, I think a lot of people maybe do think that the answer is yes to that, and okay, that can be true in some circumstances if they're fed 100% grain. Yeah, they might be sick, but the reason that
feeding your kid 100% Snickers.
Yeah, right. Or anything even good, 100% milk, 100% water is not going to be good for someone. There's too much of anything. So one, there's good reason, why all of these, modern abundance egg production facilities would have PhD nutritionists working with them to formulate it, because everything, you take corn, you take forage, you take all these ingredients, you break them down to the nutrients within that ingredient, and that's ultimately what you're feeding for, is the nutrients. The nitrogen, the carbs, the fats, the vitamins, the minerals, those sort of things are ultimately what the diets are formulated for. And so the The reason, one, that, if you fed too much corn, acidosis can maybe happen where there's an upset stomach and the pH can get too low in the rumen. But that's why you formulate diets to not have that happen,
What percentage of, how often does that happen, acidosis? Is that when people would, just to connect in logic, when people say that it makes them sick, is that what they're probably referring to as acidosis? Or do they not that they would even know?
I don't even know if they know that much. I just think they think that it's not, to them, it's not what they think cattle should be doing.
Just on,
and I think there's also a portion of it that it looks funny because to me, this is a reason why I think people maybe think this way. Corn looks like human food. Grass doesn't look like human food. They don't like the idea of waste, and we hear about starving people in the world. Eating something that humans could eat to cattle seems counterproductive. And so there's a lot of these reasons why corn gets a bad rap, I think. But from an illness standpoint, I don't actually know what the reason is, but if
let's
acidosis
assume that,
maybe
give
is
them the benefit of the doubt that they're somehow to actually have an idea of what they're talking about, and it's acidosis.
Yeah.
What percentage do you, is that a tiny percent, or is it a realistic, decent amount of cattle have acidosis?
It's so on a really, if you had, if the diets weren't formulated well, there's a chance that everything could get acidotic or have acidosis. But on places that are run well and have good nutrition programs and feeding regimens, it would be a pretty small amount of animals. And there's tiers to acidosis.
Sure.
It's called subacute acidosis or acute acidosis. Subacute is a certain threshold of pH in the rumen, and then acute would be an even lower level. If they're in acute, that doesn't happen all that often. There are instances where it does happen, though, because all of these animals are fed in a pen environment. And so you feed them. So say there's 100 animals in this pen. You deliver 25 pounds of feed per head per day into that bunk, but there's actually no telling this animal eats 25, this animal eats 25. The average of that pen is 25. Yeah. There might be a few in there that indulge and eat a lot more, and that can lead to pH dropping, and then maybe they would get acidosis. But by and large, it's if it's becoming an issue, the nutritionist is going to be fired or tweaking their rations, or they
look at the cattle every day. They have trained staff, like they're looking for the health of them all the time. Pen riders, and
there's signs that indicate subacute.
But you can also get to play the other end of the spectrum on the theme of too much. Like back in New Zealand, a common problem is on the other end, too much of really flourishing clover, fast growing legumes.
Yep.
We have another metabolic disease which is called bloat. Which is a gaseous distension of the rumen, which kills cattle. It can kill off, a big percentage of them if they get into these pastures that are we call them too hot.
Any Yellowstone fans out there?
Depicted in Yellowstone?
Oh, that's exactly right.
Yeah, they drop.
Yellowstone, the Netflix series?
Yeah, or the Paramount or whatever it's on. But right, they try to essentially
put a bunch of
sabotaging another
field.
They drop it out of a helicopter.
Yeah.
Well, back home, we have to, on our dairy farms with our heavily, our really improved pastures, like they're spectacular, and they're loaded with, we in New Zealand, we apply a lot of nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen, which, a lot of the grass proponents wouldn't know about, but we apply a ton of DAP, diammonium phosphate, and urea to our pastures to make them grow so good. And but you can get, these pastures can get too hot, and then we have to drench our cattle with an anti-bloat product twice a day at the milking while they're being milked. We actually give them like a liter of an anti-foaming agent to stop them from getting sick. So it's very widely practiced. And so on both ends of the spectrum, you can have too much of a good thing. I think that's the point.
Yeah.
And the role of nutritionists is to balance everything out. Yeah.
So unless we're looking at small percentages, in the general, this whole idea of feeding grain to cattle is is BS. Or sorry, it makes them sick is BS.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a
So next time I get a
safe
message, I can just tell them they're full of shit.
Yeah, tell them the
Okay.
BS.
My,
my
doctor
watch
brother told me
Yellowstone.
to tell you watch Yellowstone.
Yeah, it's a funny thing because
It is.
they've used it. The other thing is it's become kind of a little bit pernicious. The marketing or the defaming of grain feeding cattle in order to elevate this so-called grass feeding, grass fed, grass finished, has become an area of the market in beef that's become quite valuable. People pay more for that, and so it's been unfortunate. But the marketers of grass fed and grass finished have, in order to grow their market share, have decided to impugn and denigrate the conventional farming system of feeding during the finishing period. Let's say the last 5 months of the cattle's life, to feed them grains and other byproducts, as we talked, citrus pulp and cottonseed and all of these other things that, like Jack said, are lumped in and called grains. So they're playing this very, I think it's a very disingenuous game of trying to devour your brother in order to get to gain yourself. It's like a Cain and Abel thing.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of that, and I think it's terrible, because at the end of the day, the message should be that all beef is good. And in some situations, grass-fed and grass-finished, like in New Zealand and in Uruguay and Chile and parts of Australia, like in Victoria, where we can grow grass 12 months of the year, 10 months of the year. And we don't have any grain because we can't grow grains in some of these places. Well, then grass feeding fits perfectly. And it's great for the environment and great for the cattle, and everyone wins. But in other environments, like you go to Egypt, or you go to Indonesia, or Vietnam, or you go to Jordan or Israel, or you go to Saudi Arabia for that matter, and then you're going to try and you're going to try and grass feed your cattle there. Like, there is no bloody grass. There is no prairie. So there we have to use the resources, the food sources that are available. To your point, Tommy, then you can, because of the miracle of a cow with her digestive system, then we can start feeding her coconut meal, like in Indonesia, or palm kernel meal that they have in Malaysia, as example, or rice, broken rice in Thailand. And in Egypt, the same thing, with rice or with bakery products, because they, from the huge human population, there's a lot of bakery, wheat-based, you know. So all of these things, it's like horses for courses, and these cattle are so adaptable.
What's horses for courses?
Horses for courses, that's the old saying, match them up properly.
I like it.
You
It's
like
a
that?
cool band.
Yeah. So like getting it right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot
It's
of
fairly interesting, to be fair.
gotta get that. On an international scale, that's a lot of examples. But that's also for those listening. If you're mostly an audience in the States here, the same principle and kind of general concept of feeding what makes sense is applied and practiced here. I think maybe we already talked about this in the last one, but to make this a standalone episode, if people haven't listened to the former, we've got the famously abundant grass grazing lands in the West, and then the Corn Belt, and on a national level, that's like a synergy that we background them and graze the 85% of their life. You talked about they're eating forages. That would happen in that scenario, and then bring them over to bring them east and finish them.
Yeah, I mean that's right.
Bring them to the Corn Belt.
Bring them to where the corn is, and
the big populations with all the food waste.
All the byproduct industry.
All the industry is right here.
Yep, this is Side note, Tommy did his PhD, your thesis, right? Is an interesting study in this area, but what was it? It was with hemp.
Yeah, looking at hemp. So it's another good example of why the ruminant gets called upon to, make other industries look good. The hemp with the Farm Bill in 2018, it's been banned for long time
as a
hemp
feed,
because as a crop.
Oh,
can't grow it in the U.S. because for a long time we had no way of differentiating hemp from marijuana. THC is the psychoactive component of weed, marijuana. It just happens to be higher in marijuana strains and lower in hemp strains. And CBD is the sister molecule. So THC, psychoactive, CBD, not psychoactive. They're sister molecules. And so differentiating them for a long time was the lab techniques weren't there. So it was just easier to ban all hemp production, crop production in the U.S. However, it did go on for quite a while, but basically in the 70s, it was banned in the 30s and phased out in the 70s all the way. It took a while actually. People for some reason were hesitant to give it up. But then with the Farm Bill of 2018, it has been approved for crop production. So you can industrially grow hemp in all the states. They have the ability to allow it now.
Sure.
And so it's, with anything new in the market, it's quite volatile. So there's 18, 19, and 20 were big surges in hemp production. And then all of a sudden, there's not a huge market for all of the products.
Sure.
And so the oil, CBD oils that people would be quite familiar with today, that's a human side thing. People like the anti-inflammatory components of these oils. So you grow hemp, plants that can be taller than,
corn.
Dad, you're like 5'6", Jack's 6'4", taller than
6'3".
Yeah,
the afro
that can be taller than all
With
of us
the
here.
afro.
These hemp plants can get quite tall, but if you're only taking the seed and then taking the oil out of that seed, there's a lot of wasted product there again. And so
that's the theme, that wherever there's industry, there's byproduct.
You better have ruminants nearby. And so the highly fibrous product, my dissertation itself was looking at the seeds. They would squeeze them, take the oil, you're left with this hemp seed product that has most of the oil removed. So a natural market to make that oil industry more, enticing to stay in and possible to stay in. You have to have markets for the byproduct. And so I was looking to see if it's safe and makes sense to feed this byproduct from hemp production to cattle. And cattle was the logical choice to put it into because they can utilize the fiber like we were talking about before.
What was in a nutshell, was it safe to feed them?
Yes.
And was it productive?
Sure. Seemed safe, and depends on what you're comparing it to, but for sure it's productive. There's a lot of protein in it and a lot of fiber. Just two things, energy and protein is what the microbes need. And remember, we're feeding the microbes in the cattle, and so it makes sense to, it was a pretty good product. It's not as digestible as some other staples in the industry. The byproduct from the ethanol industry is the distiller's grains, and that's the gold standard now for byproducts.
And these would be probably priced accordingly, though, too, right? Like with so it's
So
the alternative
at the right
is getting no value out of it without cattle.
Yep.
Even though it might not be as good as distillers.
To me, it seemed like the takeaway would be that, if it's priced properly, probably relative to distillers or to corn itself, then it would
might have a place.
So that's just one small example of how ruminants can kind of help other industries check their boxes of making them sustainable. You know?
Yeah, economically too.
And economically.
Like if you took away the ability to feed the byproduct, then the actual main product might not be viable anymore.
Is that what you mean by?
Now you lose that, and you lose all the jobs, and you lose all the.
Correct.
A good one that also comes to mind on this theme is two things. One is like the miracle of cattle is to turn inedible products into ribeyes.
Yeah.
Like that is a magical trick. Like that's like God really wanted that to happen. So there's that. And then number two is like another good one is there's a lot of people that are really keen on green energy. So here we come back to energy again. And so they say one of the greenest energies is ethanol, corn ethanol. Well, well, we could talk about that too. So you grow corn, and then you're going to extract the sugars out of that in the form of ethanol, and then you're going to use that to fuel your car rather than use the fossil fuels. And but the ethanol industry is already subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer, terribly. And then they have to force you to use it because the shit is so bad for your vehicles, and people wouldn't, and it can't compete with oil. So they mandate it. You got to have 10% or 15%, whatever, in your tank at the gas station. So that's number one. So it's already subsidized. We're subsidizing farmers to grow corn, to burn that corn and get ethanol out of it. So it's already uneconomical. And then the second thing is there's a huge waste product from the extraction of ethanol out of corn. And I don't know how much it is, but let's just say it's 60% of its waste. Well, they're only, and that would all be a loss, an economic loss, if it wasn't for cattle. So, and that's where this word, you guys have been talking about distiller's grains, but a lot of people listening wouldn't know what the hell distiller's grain is, but that's what it is. It's a byproduct of the distillation of corn to get ethanol from it. And so again, the cattle industry is saving the ethanol industry, which is so-called saving the planet.
Yeah.
So it's all resting on cows. And God loves cows, and so do we.
Amen.
So amen to that.
Especially in India.
Yeah, and especially in India. But they have a different God, so yeah.
And a different love for him.
Yeah.
They don't love the ribeye, per se.
Speaking of our love for him, the eating and obvious benefit there, is there all these different byproducts or feeds that we've talked about? Is there a noticeable difference in flavor that... and maybe this is a hard question to answer, but you talked about, let's pull two of the most extreme, distillers versus citrus pulp or coconut meal. Is there a difference in the flavor of the meat that comes out of that?
For the consumer?
Yeah, like I could almost see it being like a a marketable thing, like coconut
flavored ribeye,
fed cat beef, but
right.
And maybe there is a difference, but I've never thought about it.
No, so in general, the answer would be no.
Sure.
It's not completely true, though. With some ingredients can influence flavor. It mostly comes from the fats that are produced, and so that's why. Well, maybe we'll touch on it too. But grass-fed versus grain-fed, there's
so much better.
Quantifiable, consumer preference differences between the two. Comes from the fatty acid profile, but for the most part, these products would be, some of them would, if they're broken down in the rumen, they're just broken down to their nutrient constituents, and then they get incorporated into the body just
as the nutrient.
There's no taint.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So it's not like if you
what about
aged a wine in a whiskey barrel, you get that.
Right.
Yeah.
There's not that effect.
Not to say maybe there's something, I don't know.
I think you could
in general, the answer is no, but I don't know for
have
sure.
You ever had
everything.
have you heard of boar taint?
Yes.
Excuse me?
It's just horrendous. Excuse me, how dare you?
Good band name.
Yeah.
Boar taint meat raffle. No, boar taint is horrible. It's from when you have an older male, an intact boar, who's not castrated, and the meat is just horrendous.
Oh, I have heard of this.
Yeah, and it's so strong in the deleteriously strong flavor.
Yep.
And when you hunt wild pigs, like back home, with Uncle Jeremy but they shoot these wild boars and to me it's just horrendous. You want to eat the piglets.
Is this your way of telling him, or does he know this? Do you think this way?
No, he knows damn well. I'm sure all those pig hunters don't want to eat the old boars.
Yeah.
And then they have, sometimes in Europe they don't have, in some European countries they don't have castration of pigs anymore. Well, they have a chemical castration rather than the physical cutting of the testicles. And sometimes it doesn't work, and so you inadvertently you get it with some meals.
Oh.
So, but I wonder why that. I wonder what those flavor molecules are versus.
I suppose the difference there is that it's producing it in the body as opposed to
Yes,
Oh.
so it would be a metabolite inside. But the same for lamb, actually, though. So it's here at NDSU, they're actually quite interested in if you can. So lamb, that market hasn't increased in quite a long time, with the U.S. consumer. And one of the reasons is
decreasing.
Because if you just try it in the store, you end up getting what that wool flavor or that that off
Oily.
flavor, mutton flavor sort of in lamb once in a while. And without being able to identify that, this lamb chop will have that amount of that flavor, because to a small percentage of people, it's actually a desirable flavor.
No.
So if you could quantify how much flavor that is in this lamb chop, you could help the consumer, and then people could select for the low. I can't remember what that compound is called, though. I'm gonna have to look that up. But
It's like a lanolin.
yeah, it's something like that, though, where
so you could seek out to your preference,
Yes.
a low or high in this.
That's a horrible taste if you ever have that. It's like you want to just take your
It's
tongue
so-
and go,
Yeah, it's so bad.
it's so bad.
Yeah,
but
so you
it's
see
to
the
do
peop-
with castrates. It's to do with males as well, or no?
Don't really know.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it definitely is tainting the
Yep.
meat.
It's but they know what compound it is, and so that was my point. Is that there is a metabolite in the body that they have pinpointed as the one that
Identified.
carries that flavor, and then it's just the levels of that are the issue.
Have you seen or heard of olive-fed Wagyu being marketed? I see it pop up every once in a while that
Yeah.
they're totally promoting that. I don't know what it is, if it's in the finishing or their whole life they're fed olives, but it's a very clear marketing point that's fetching an additional premium already on obviously crazy expensive.
What's the
Wagyu.
reason?
I don't know.
What is it adding?
I don't know. I have no idea. I just
Oleic acid.
Yeah, but so that's the other thing about the rumen, that you can feed them any sort of fat you want, but it's going to come out
as
it's going
the
to
same
leave the
thing.
rumen as a saturated fat.
so it doesn't. To your, very new knowledge of this product, it probably is a
Maybe they're
marketing ploy.
massaging
it's-
them in olive oil. Like
Is it olive
in
oil or are they
Japan.
feeding them
I think it
olives?
says all I have seen of it is olive fed Wagyu.
Interesting. I'll have to
but
look
I-
into that. But if it's
yeah.
for the fat properties, it's a losing
I'm
battle.
going to go out
try
on a
to-
limb here and say it's just pure marketing.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I'm getting at after.
There's so much
when I
BS
asked the
out there.
question, I hadn't even remembered that example. But
Yeah, no,
but
I've
there is
seen
an
it too,
example of
Jack.
being marketed.
I've seen it as well.
Huh.
The meat comes out looking a little bit green.
Comes out looking white because it's just all fat.
True.
Yeah, like there's not enough fat already in Wagyu.
Yeah. Anyways, I don't know what they're. I'm
Playing
sure they
with-
have some sort of
Playing
claim
with
that
flavor
it
profiles.
does. Yeah,
Some sort.
because you can obviously influence the flavor after the.
I'll have to look into that. That isn't back to your question though about how certain ingredients, if they can change the end
But-
product flavor. Yeah, that
Yeah.
may be.
Your
something
quick
there.
answer though of that
Mm-hmm.
no matter what fat is fed, it kind of all comes out the same. So
Yeah.
it doesn't. But there is. Why is it then? There's a discernibly different, and in my opinion, better taste between grain fed as a category versus grass fed, grass finished.
Amount of fat would be one.
Oh, okay.
But also the profiles are slightly different. So in general, plants.
So that's a very noticeable flavor difference.
Yeah, and color too, right? So
color
looks
the
you
fat,
can
too.
you can actually identify the
More
the
yellow
is
fat.
more yellow from these pasture.
Carotenoids.
Yep, the grass fed ones. So that would be one reason the flavor difference is that there just happens to be a higher degree of fat coating finish to the grain fed animals, and fat carries a lot of flavor. It has a lot of tenderness properties and
Sure.
things like that, and so that gets picked up in these consumer panels where there's taste tests done. But it in general, the rule is that if these plant compounds, they contain unsaturated fatty fats. Their oils are unsaturated, and then in the rumen, through it's called biohydrogenation, they're putting hydrogens onto this fat. The microbes do it because unsaturated fats are toxic to microbes. So in order to get their living environment more hospitable, they throw some hydrogens onto that fat. They
Crazy.
saturate it. It's now fully saturated with hydrogens. There's no double bonds. So it's all, if you picture a carbon, has 4 lines coming off it. One of them goes to the next carbon. omega-3 go to hydrogens. If it's unsaturated, there's a double bond, which means there's one less hydrogen that could be on there, so it's not saturated. So long story short, microbes put a hydrogen on there, goes through the rumen, and it leaves as a saturated fat, fully saturated with hydrogens. And so even if you wanted to really manipulate the fatty profile, it's difficult because of that mechanism. There are some fats that can sneak through, though, and you can play with...
bypass fats.
Yeah, you can have some bypass, but for the most part, fats aren't... They all bypass. Sure. So they're not degraded, they're just manipulated. So they're not... Fats aren't fermentable. They're just modified in the rumen. But they're not used by the microbes necessarily there. Yeah.
What a crazy freaking scene that's happening in the room.
It's like
if you zoomed in,
it's
so
like
great. There's an entire...
It's like a fire drill. They get the unsaturated fats, and someone rings the bell, and here they come running with all the hydrogens.
Just be easier if the cattle ate saturated fats. The microbes they'd be bored.
They'd
have nothing to do.
Right. Very interesting. You know, there are some health aspects that get talked about with pasture or grass fed. They talk about them having higher omega-3 fats, and and that's it. So it's part of this fatty acid profile, and then they tout that as being good for cardiovascular. And by inference, they suggest that grain-fed or conventionally fed cattle, could be, not good for your cardiovascular. But by benefit of eating grass, now you are a superfood. And that's played out in all the marketing and part of driving people to try and spend more money on grass-fed beef, which is, discernibly tougher, more chewy. I would say less tasteful, less tasty. But anyway, that's part of the deal. So they say, pasture has much higher omega-3s and omega-3 to 6 ratio is better, and then higher CLAs, conjugated linoleic acids. And but anyway, so is there any truth to those sort of claims, or is it more like there's a difference, but it doesn't matter a hill of beans,
Yep. So it seems that there is a difference. There may be more omega-3s that can be found in.
Is that in fresh grass, or just in all, even dormant or even silage grass? Or is it only with like actively growing grass?
I don't know.
Okay.
Don't know for sure, but I know the studies that look at it, or that they would suggest that there is slightly more omega-3s that end up in the the grass-fed beef compared to the grain-fed. But is it biologically relevant as far as influencing health outcomes? The anti-inflammatory properties of omega-3, that's pretty well studied. So it sounds good to have grass-fed beef have more omega-3s, but how much more, and is it a meaningful amount more? And I think that answer is, it's most likely to be no. I think I've heard you say this before, but if you want your omega-3s, you shouldn't be eating beef in the first place.
Yeah,
it's not
salmon, right? Or
you
mackerel.
need to eat so much damn beef to get your omega-3 fill to make a meaningful difference that you're going to have a whole other, it'd be a fun challenge, actually, to try to get your omega-3s through a ribeye. But
I've heard, what was the comparison? Eating beef for omega-3s is like eating carrots for protein.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I think you can eat if you ate one meal of salmon a week, that provides something like 25 times as much omega-3s as, one meal of of any beef, whether it's grass or grain-fed.
It's funny,
so
they've singled it out.
That principle is, it's talked about. There's other scenarios like implanted beef versus non-implanted beef, the estrogen content of that product. Is there more? Yes. Is it a meaningful amount? Well, no. It
like
doesn't seem to be
trivial amount.
It's very, very small relative to other things. And so that kind of line of thinking, you can't say no, there's not more omega-3s in the grass-fed, but
they don't give you the scale of the graph that you're looking at.
Right.
Yeah,
so
I think like mackerel and
on
salmon are like, maybe it's like 250 or 2,500 on whatever it is, nanograms, and again, micromoles. Excuse me, I don't quite remember, but yeah, and grass-fed is like 6, and grain-fed's like 3.
Yeah.
Versus, so the axis of the comparison is like if you throw in the salmon as example, then it goes through the roof, the scale.
It won't even register.
So
And just in general, you shouldn't. There's not one singular food can give you
everything.
absolutely everything. It just happens that some foods offer more nutrient dense offerings than others, and there just isn't a single thing out there that gives you the perfect balance of every single thing you need for every person.
But beef gets pretty close to it.
If there
You
was
can get all the
one,
carnivores after
That's
you.
the one.
it's beef.
Well, like Richard Wrangham, the great paleo scientist, anthropologist.
I know him.
He's
I don't either.
he wrote the Catching Fire.
Oh,
That great book. I think you
right
guys
there.
have read it too. You got the book over there. Yeah, I mean he
Go read
makes
it to us,
that
Jack.
Yeah.
great case of like eating meat liberated. That's what made us human. That's his hypothesis. It's pretty compelling.
Cooking it.
Yeah, right. So we cooked it, and we talked before about how we can't digest fiber and lignin and cellulose, and that's why baboons and gorillas and chimps, they have a guts, that's out here
Yeah.
because
as
they're
a proportion of their body.
right as a proportion of their body. They got a huge stomach. Like if you ran out their intestines, it'd go like from Fargo down to Sioux Falls.
To be fair, a lot of the U.S. has a huge stomach too.
Well, right. Yeah, you've been to Walmart lately? Like, holy shistry. No, you do have a point.
They're resorting back to historic times.
Yeah. But anyway, we
Less of a
were able
function.
to get rid of our gut through fire and cooking meat, meat and fat.
Send more
And
nutrient to the
you bet,
brain.
more nutrients to the brain because all that protein and then the fat, with gluconeogenesis, and the brain needs glucose, right? And anyway, that liberated us. So then we were able to get rid of our gut, and or most of us, or some of us, and move to predominantly eating meat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what made us human. It's a very compelling story. That's very, very plausible.
Yeah, I think it holds a lot of merit. And
so then we
What about
started
the,
chasing the ungulates, right? The ruminants across the prairie, and they've been our main food source ever since. Large ruminants.
What about
vitamins
the,
and minerals and proteins and fat come from, you can get that all in a steak.
All in one meal.
Mm-hmm.
This has nothing to do with what we've been talking about, but what about is it the stoned ape
Oh yeah,
theory? That's
that's a equally compelling.
Oh,
just
man.
just purely on interesting. Unless you guys can reel me in if this does not fit the script, but
It fits.
what's the what is that? It's the
think
stoned ape theory.
Stoned ape is isn't that the psilocybin and the Ulyssian mysteries, the Dionysian mysteries?
Yes,
In a word, yes.
I think so. So it's the psilocybin. I don't know.
Yeah.
exactly
Is the
how it
idea that an
besides it
ape came across psilocybin, became enlightened?
Yes, and it was growing in pastures, so it pulled them down from the trees, and they kept searching out in these open fields and became more ground-bearing or ground-based animals. But the psilocybin or the mushroom, I think, gave them a greater realm of thinking. Is that right? Or greater consciousness and greater or expanded thought processes, and then that led to further developing, moving away from the treetops and becoming more upright species. It's
interesting. I wonder if they.
I wonder if there's a combination of the two.
I was going to say, they seem that they could be coexist or works together. The two compelling arguments.
If they're cooking the mushrooms, though, then that burns out the psilocybin.
You just cook
so
the
they
meat.
have to cook the meat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep talking about this. We might have Joe Rogan walk through that door. So let's be careful.
Just don't mention DMT.
Yeah.
We'll be here.
Sturgill with him.
Yeah. No, it's a brilliant theory. I think there's a lot, both of them. Both of them can work together.
Yeah.
Well, they do work together. One's sort of mostly physiological, like digestive and growth and brain and proportion of our anatomical changes. And then the other is our, consciousness.
Yeah.
And so I think they're both of them fold in together very well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I read another book about the psychedelic appetite of all organisms, all the way from mollusks, to
Caribou.
right, to caribou and to every elephants. It's a great book. Every animal, sheep,
What is
goats.
it called? Do you know the name?
No, I don't. It's all. Anyway, it's on my shelf. But it is really an interesting book about how even ants and insects and from the smallest to the biggest all seek out psychedelics, actively seek them out. And here we are. We've been like ever since the '60s. We've been there's so much legal and pressure to against to criminalize any use of it, but it seems like they've been with us forever since we literally fell out of the tree and
something instinctive
stood upright. Yeah,
yeah, living things to seek that out.
Yeah. No, it's really incredible.
To plug that name of the book into the description of this episode or something, maybe.
Yeah,
it's worth reading. It's a quick read, but it's
not
a good
called
one.
Animals and Psychedelics, is it?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
That's
it.
aptly named.
Yeah.
Animals
It's got a
and
very
Psychedelics.
psychedelic cover on the book too.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Looks like
No, it's fascinating.
Tyler Childers.
Yeah,
music
really,
video.
from ants to elephants. Every animal that they've looked at has a predilection or an active search for them. Yeah,
Interesting,
isn't it?
I'll have to give that one a read. I don't know
Yeah,
that
Yeah.
available on Barnes and Noble.
Yep.
$7.99.
That and the Alchemy of Air. Yep, and Our Daily Bread. That's the Norman Borlaug book. That's really great. That's worth reading.
Catching Fire was the other one.
Catching Fire
Reference.
Fire.
is another wonderful, great book, I think.
It's the Hunger Games series, right?
How dare you?
Isn't that the same name of the?
I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just watch the movies then.
Yeah.
Skip the reading.
So our take home, I think we didn't get to methane and the role cattle play with that, or in relation to more myth busting, if you will. I think maybe next time we could pick that up, because I think there's a lot of things could be clarified there to take away this alarmism about eating beef. Because I think in people's hearts they love beef. And they love to have a good meal of beef. Like it actually beats everything.
Oh, for sure.
And people but they've been made to feel bad about it, and that needs to stop. And so I think if we can help people get more understanding about it, including the climate issue, the greenhouse gas, that they call cow farts, and clear that whole thing up and put it in perspective, then I think people can not only, they can feel good about enjoying like wonderful beef, whether it's grass-fed or grass and grain-fed or whatever, as long as the animals are being looked after, and being raised responsibly, and the farm families are doing their best to look after the land and the animals, and there's no reason why we can't just feel like, hell yes.
Yeah.
We're going to love our beef. We're going to eat more of it. Damn straight.
Love it.
Yeah.
That's
a
good.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, fellas. I learned a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Always, this is super fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you both.